Well, do you believe in the resurrection? Do you believe in the resurrection? You know, if you don't, you have good company in the Christian church. There are quite a few people who don't believe in the resurrection. There are ministers who don't believe in it. I'm not quite sure why they're still ministers, but they don't believe in it. It's actually quite hard to believe that he rose from the dead. It defies all our human knowledge, the way we think and see things, especially in the Western world, and it's inexplicable. It's unlike all other historical evidence in the Bible, at least the majority of it, not only has the witness of those who believed in God, but also the witness of those who didn't believe in God. For example, I love Emperor Hadrian 361 to 363 or 4, a Roman emperor. He hated Christians, but he wrote about them, saying to his people, they outdo us in kindness and justice to all people. I just love him because he tells us what Christians were doing. It wasn't Christians saying to us what we were doing. But do you believe in the resurrection? If we don't believe them, if we don't believe those first witnesses, because that's all we have, the first witnesses, and the problem lies with this, that those who experienced or saw Jesus rise from, or they saw the risen Jesus, they believed. And so we only have the witnesses who believed. And if we don't want to believe them, how did we get here today? How did we get here today if there was not a resurrection? That's a better question to ask. Not whether it happened, but why are we here today? How did we get here? If you don't believe the resurrection, then Jesus is a loser, not a winner. If you don't believe the resurrection, Jesus is a victim, not a victor. If you don't believe the resurrection, then we don't have the cross of Jesus. I mean, the cross of Jesus is important because the crucified Jesus rose from the dead. No resurrection means that Jesus was just an itinerant Jewish teacher from Nazareth who performed some miracles, did some teaching, some quite profound, but none of his teaching was new. What was new was the profound insight he gave the Old Testament teachings. Jesus only taught us about God's mercy, loving our neighbor, and loving our enemy. And the latter too was in the Old Testament by implication. And by the way, do you know that since Jesus, there have been 50 claimants to be the Messiah or the Christ? Messiah is a Jewish word for the Greek word Christ, or vice versa. There have been 50 of them. And you know that in Jesus' time, at least following his death, in the latter part of the first century, there was a real Messiah for those who wanted a military Messiah. There was Simon Bar Kokhba. He defeated the Romans, and Emperor Hadrian took 6 legions to conquer his army after 2 years. Now there was a Messiah figure for you. Have you heard of Simon Bar Kokhba? I doubt it. If Jesus was only an itinerant teacher 2,000 years ago, how come a small band of disciples courageously followed him, and today there are 2.38 billion, not million, billion Christians? Christianity is the world's largest religion. I want you to think of those first days after the crucifixion when Jesus' followers were persecuted by Jewish authorities. The first Christians were Jews, and the temple authorities persecuted them. It wasn't long before one of them was stoned to death. And the leader and orchestrator of that stoning was a man by the name of Saul, Saul of Tarsus, a very excellent Pharisee. And Saul was authorized by the temple authorities to go to Antioch, where there's a collection of Christ followers. And on the road, he encounters Jesus. He encounters Jesus on the road and becomes a believer. And that's amazing. So this exceptional Pharisee, Saul of Tarsus, now becomes a missionary to the Gentiles, and he uses the Latin version of Saul, Paul, as his name. And we know him as Paul, the apostle. So the persecutor became the promoter. The only possible reason for these first followers becoming bold witnesses is a life-changing experience with the living Christ Jesus. We can't explain the resurrection as it defies our human explanation, but what else could have changed frightened followers into bold witnesses? All we can do is experience the resurrection. We need to enter that experience. See, the resurrection tells us that God's love dispels the darkness of the world. The resurrection tells us that evil has no ultimate power over us. If you think about that, there's plenty of evidence for this. The resurrection tells us that death is not final. We have come from God and will return to God. The resurrection tells us that we have salvation from sin, that ugliness that holds us, that selfishness that controls our lives. The resurrection tells us that we have a future in God's world. The resurrection tells us that God's promises are kept. The resurrection tells us that we will retain our personhood, though the body may change. I can only go back to my story and tell you some of my experiences that may add to the experience of the resurrection. When I was 18 years just short of my 18th year, I was very troubled by the fact that my life had no meaning and I seemed to not have control of all the things I'd like to have control of. I was seeking a freedom. I was seeking a meaning. And I had friends, a girlfriend in particular, but I was taken along to those Christian services. I hadn't been brought up in Sunday school. I managed to escape that. I only went to youth groups where I used to go and check out the chicks. But what else do you go to youth groups for? I don't know. Anyway, I went along to this meeting and there was an evangelical call to come forward if you wanted to give your life to Jesus. I was the only one that did it. I went up forward. And as I knelt there at the communion trail, I experienced a freedom and a release and a meaning to my life that changed me completely. Well, dramatically, let's say. About 6 months later, I was doing my army service, which I had to do, and I was praying one night, just my routine prayers. They were just a little routine that I took place, and I had this vision that intruded on my mind, a picture of myself in a pulpit and a voice saying, "I want you to be a minister." And I ran off to my bed, and I sat there trembling, if not externally, internally. I was thinking, this is the beginning of religious mania. I really was disturbed. It took me 3 months to work through that vision and that call. It was not a simple yes. Some years later, I walked into my bedroom, having had a cuppa with my mum in the kitchen, and I walked into my bedroom, and there in the corner was a bright, bright light, a person, hardly distinct. There for a while, and then I knew it was Jesus. I don't know what it was about. I don't know what was said. I had no meaning of it, no interpretation, but just presence. And over the years, through conversations, through prayer life, taking time out with people and alone, my life is dotted with milestones of Jesus, empowering moments with the Holy Spirit. And all I can say is that I believe, I kind of know in me that Christ is alive and gives life. I don't talk much about these things. It seems too awkward for us to speak about such matters. In fact, it's quite nice to be a few feet above contradiction here and a few feet away from you and say these things. It's kind of easier on me and easier on you to receive them, because you can sit back there and say, yeah, he's a bit nutty, that guy. It's okay. So are you. We don't want to talk about these personal things because they sound silly or personal, and they certainly don't sound sensible in our very sensible, logical world in which we live. So I hide them too, sometimes by my quirky humour. But have you noted, and especially those of you who come regularly, those of you who see yourselves in the church, have you noted that churches like ours, we don't talk about God, we don't talk of God, we talk about God, we talk about the church mainly. We don't talk about our experiences of Jesus. Now my question to you is, have you had such encounters? You may answer no. I've had people say no, and then I prod them with questions. It's amazing what we can recall, how there are moments in our lives that have brought us to this point that we sit here most Sundays or come occasionally because we know that there's something bigger than us. And we've shut these things out, these personal experiences of God, because our society, even our church, likes to keep things normal and respectable, above all sensible. And we don't like things to be out of control. You know, it's like sailing a boat. You like the wind to be right, or you manage your sail so you keep on an even keel. You don't want to let the wind overpower you and you heel over and fall in the water or something like that. It's like that with our life and religion and God. We want to hang on to things and keep it in control. So we shut out the extraordinary religious happenings. And if we do so, we won't experience them. We limit our openness to God's possibility for us. And that way we remain in control. My friends, search your hearts. Have you shut God out by subscribing to the sensibility and the respectability of our society? Have you shut God out because you're too scared to lose control of things? And my friends, do you really think that you are here simply because Jesus told us to love our neighbours, our enemies and each other, of which neither of them we do very well, and that he isn't really alive? Do you really think that the church exists just because there's a little bit of love and kindness in the world? Have you really closed your hearts and minds to the great cloud of witnesses in the church down through the ages who've experienced the risen Christ? My colleague John, in an eloquent sermon, reminded us of certain things, and he referred to Stoddard Kennedy's poem, Indifference. Stoddard Kennedy saw people following the Great First War in about 1920 He saw that people being indifferent to God. It's a brilliant little poem. I think today Stoddard Kennedy would not talk about our indifference, but our unbelief. I want to say to you, Jesus is alive. Jesus of Nazareth rose from the grave. He is alive there for you, there for us, right close. Just turn around, check out. He's there for you. And you too can experience the amazing love and wonder of the resurrection. May God bless us.